Everyone born in the 80s loves to say, "I survived the 80s." Riding bikes with no helmets, home alone at 5, no seatbelts, no sunscreen, no supervision. And yeah, most of you turned out fine. But here's what nobody tells you. Neuroscience says your brain was permanently rewired by that childhood. Some of it made you extraordinary. And some of it broke something you still haven't fixed. This isn't another remember the 80s nostalgia trip. This is what science actually found when they studied your generation's brain. Why you see things other generations miss. Why you adapt when others freeze. And why you've always felt like you don't quite fit in, or anywhere. Here's the thing about growing up in the 80s. Your mum didn't schedule playdates. She opened the front door and said, "Be back before dark." You were 9 years old walking to the community swimming pool by yourself. Your mum's only instruction? Just get out of my house for the day. From 3rd grade on, some of you didn't see your parents until dinner. You came home from school on the bus to an empty house at 5. You made your own snacks. You settled your own fights. You entertained yourself with nothing but a bike and a vague sense of direction. And here's where it gets interesting. Psychologists call this unstructured play. When you played, it was not just playtime, but a training time too. Like an invisible class was opened in your mind. Dr. Peter Gray at Boston College found that unstructured play is an important factor in developing self-regulation, problem-solving, and emotional resilience. Because of the absence of adults, parents, or teachers, children have to learn to control their emotions and behavior. When a child plays alone, there are no rules or help from others, so he tries to deal with problems on his own, and the problems affecting his feelings, such as the pain in his knee when he falls, or failure in solving the puzzle, teach him how to recover without an adult's guidance. It basically means your brain learns to handle uncertainty by being thrown into it without a safety net, no script, no adult hovering, just you figuring it out. Your parents didn't give you freedom because they were careless. They accidentally gave you the exact neurological training ground that modern kids are missing. That's not neglect. That's neurological advantage. But your childhood wasn't just bikes and empty houses. You were about to witness something no generation before you had ever seen. You didn't just grow up in the 80s. You grew up in the last decade before everything changed. You remember a world with no internet, no smartphones, no Google. If you wanted to know something, you went to a library. If you wanted to talk to a friend, you called their house and hoped their dad didn't pick up. And then, almost overnight, everything flipped. Dial-up internet, AOL Instant Messenger, MySpace, and suddenly you were building a second life in a world that didn't exist 5 years earlier. Here's the thing, most generations either grew up analog or grew up digital. You grew up both. Researchers call this cognitive flexibility, the ability to switch between completely different ideas, adapt to new information, and process problems from many angles, instead of being stuck in a corner of thinking. You didn't just learn technology, you learned to think in 2 languages. You fixed a VCR with a kitchen knife and built your first website on GeoCities. You wrote letters by hand and figured out HTML. You navigated a world with no GPS and taught your parents how to use Google Maps. That's not confusion, that's bilingual thinking. And wild, right? Most people alive right now can only speak one of those languages. You're fluent in both. But being adaptable came at a cost, especially when the economy decided to test just how much your generation could handle. You did everything right. You went to college, you got the degree, you followed the plan your parents laid out, work hard, play by the rules, and you'll be fine. It used to be not only a dream, but also a philosophy for you. And then 2008 happened. The economy collapsed. The job market disappeared. The house you were supposed to buy, the retirement you were supposed to start, gone. The first years of your career were supposed to be the beginning of everything. Instead, they became a wound that never fully healed. The financial crisis erased hundreds of chances for juniors and freshers. It decreased the starting salary by about 15 to 20%. The gap has persisted until now, even when the economy recovered. In front of you was the risk of unemployment, and behind you was the student debt, which was reported to be around $35,000 on average. 10 years later, when you just barely found your footing, COVID-19 appeared, and inflation rose to the highest peak in 40 years. The proportion of people in the 80s generation having their own house at 30 is only 27%, which is low compared with 40% of the baby boomer generation. A milestone their parents hit almost automatically. For this generation, it became a distant dream. But the most damaging part isn't in the numbers, it's what happens inside. Psychologists have a clinical term for this: financial PTSD. Studies show that nearly half of 80s babies report chronic financial stress, not because they're bad with money, but because the system broke its promise at the exact moment they showed up to collect. The long-lasting pressure not only restructures your brain, reduces long-term thinking and raises worry, but also affects your close relationships. Money is one of the most important reasons that lead to the rising proportion of divorces in this generation. The damage is quiet, invisible, and deeply personal. The crisis also led to a big change in your mind, what Martin Seligman calls learned helplessness. When the system fails you enough times, your brain stops believing effort leads to outcome. It's not that you gave up. Your brain literally rewired around the expectation of economic uncertainty. That's not entitlement. That's pattern recognition. And right now, you're probably nodding along, thinking about your own version of these stories. But here's where this video takes a turn. And right now, you're probably smiling, thinking about your own version of these stories, riding bikes with no helmets, staying home alone at 7. But here's the plot twist nobody talks about. Some of those stories aren't funny. A 5-year-old home alone isn't building character. That's a kid who needed someone there. Some 80s babies use this "I survived the 80s" identity as armor, not as perspective, but as an excuse. "I turned out fine" becomes a way to avoid asking a much harder question. Did I, though? For most of history, nostalgia was considered a sickness, a weakness, something to overcome. Then psychologist Konstantin Sedikidis spent 20 years proving everyone wrong. Konstantin Sedikidis has studied nostalgia for 20 years and found that it's a psychological mechanism that has a protective function. In simple words, when the present is struggling, the brain finds memories in the past to remind you of your strength. Healthy nostalgia makes people more confident and encourages them to move forward. A man in his 40s finds himself thinking back to those unscheduled football matches. No coach, no rules, just a ball and a group of kids figuring it out together. That memory doesn't make him wish he was 7 again. It reminds him of something he already knows how to do: trust the people around him and let things breathe. On the other hand, Tim Wildschut, co-researcher of Sedikidis, found something called counterfactual nostalgia. This is the unhealthy nostalgia that leads people to the prison of the past. They use memories as a weapon against the difficult presents. Healthy nostalgia is a rearview mirror. It shows you where you've been so you can navigate where you're going. Unhealthy nostalgia is when you turn your seat around entirely, stare at what's behind you, and wonder why you keep losing the road ahead. The question is, which one are you? And that question, that tension between who you are and where you belong, actually has a name. You're not Gen X, you're not Millennials, and every time someone tries to put you in a box, something doesn't fit. Here's why. Psychologists call this liminal identity, existing between categories. And here's where it gets interesting. Researchers found that people who live between worlds don't just adapt, they translate. Think about it. You learn to speak boomer and millennial, analog and digital, optimism and skepticism. You code switch between generations like it's nothing, because for you it is nothing. You've been doing it your entire life. And that's why nobody knows what to do with you. You don't fit the stereotypes. You're not cynical enough to be Gen X. You're not entitled enough to be millennials. You're somewhere in the middle, seeing both sides, translating both languages, belonging to both and neither at the same time. You're not the forgotten generation. You're the bridge. Oh. So let's put this together. You built bike gangs on street corners and social networks online. You fixed VCRs with kitchen knives and troubleshot your parents' first smartphone. You survived an economy that lied to you, and you're still here. You're not lost between generations. You're the generation that translates between all of them. You're not stuck in the past. You carry it, and you use it. You're not broken by what happened. You're shaped by it, and the fact that you can even ask, did I turn out fine? That's not weakness. That's the most honest thing your generation does. Neuroscientists would call you cognitively flexible. Psychologists would call you liminal. Your parents would probably just call you stubborn. But here's what I'd call you: an emotional Swiss Army knife, built for a world that doesn't exist anymore and somehow still the most useful tool in the room. Here's your permission slip. You turned out more than fine. And if this hit different for you, I need you to do something. Drop your birth year in the comments. I want to see how many of us are out there. And if this made you rethink something about yourself, hit subscribe, because we're going even deeper. I'll see you there.